The sharks.
Look out!
Come on!
There are sharks all around us.
These sharks don't care if you live or die.
Director Anthony C. Ferrati is no stranger to shark movies. He of course brought us the Sharknado movies and also brought us Blind Waters from the Asylum. And this is another Asylum shark movie. We are talking Great White Waters. Now this actually has a plot which has kind of been seen a couple of times in recent years, where we have criminals basically lose a shipment of drugs in shark-infested waters and have to kind of go and get them back. We've seen that plot a couple of times, as I've mentioned, but here it is again in this movie. So the plot is that there is this kind of cartel of criminals that do a drug drop. They're disguised in kind of tea crates, and it's off the coast of Florida somewhere. And they have to go and retrieve these kind of crates of drugs. Of course, unbeknownst to them, there is a school of great white sharks. Also added to the mix, we have this woman who happens to be out on this particular kind of stretch of water at the same time, and she ends up kind of getting mixed up with all these kind of criminals and sharks. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. I'm sure most of you are familiar with The Asylum, a low-budget production company in the States that normally knock out kind of mockbusters, but they do have the occasional kind of original movie. And although this isn't directly a mockbuster, obviously, like I've mentioned, this kind of plot we have seen a couple of times in recent years. And it might fill you with dread. Oh, an Asylum movie, I can't bear that. But they do actually occasionally have some fairly good movies, I would say. At least if you are, used to watching lower budget movies, as I am. So how does this one fare? What can we say in the positives? I've got to say, this was actually quite a fun shark movie. And I got to be honest with you, you always forget that it's an Asylum movie, I will say. There is a few elements of goofiness, particularly involving the actual sharks themselves, but I gotta say I think this plays a little more straight than some Asylum films, a little bit more dramatic chops than maybe you've seen from a lot of their movies, and so you almost forget that it's an Asylum film, and in actual fact as well, I do think some of the VFX fare a little bit better. So let's just dive into it a little bit more. So Ferrati, as I've mentioned, is one of the people behind the Sharknado movies. Now this is not a spoof movie. I'm not a big fan of the silly shark concept movies, to be honest. I prefer, a more nuanced approach. And, this is a film that takes the subject matter more seriously. I mean, like I said, there are a few goofier elements, but for the most part, it's pretty a standard sort of dramatic movie. And one of the elements that I liked about this is that we do get to know our criminals quite a lot. The movie spends a lot of time with our group of criminals, and you actually feel like you get to know them, and they actually feel like they have somewhat sort of different personalities, and then we even have kind of almost like a bustle for leadership within this kind of group, where we have these two characters that almost are vying for the kind of the top position within this crew. So they're not all on the same page necessarily. They kind of have somewhat sort of differing personalities, and even we have a situation where we have this woman that ends up kind of getting into the mix, where we see, potentially like one of these criminals almost sort of change size to a degree. And again, I quite like this character work from these people. Without giving any spoilers away, how the movie ends up on purely a character basis, I was quite in favour of it. It didn't actually end exactly how I thought it would. The broad strokes of how I thought it would end are there, but some of the kind of the what ends up happening to certain people in this movie, I didn't think it would end up like it did, and so I was pleased that it ended up like it did, and it actually was in a way a little more grounded than I was expecting. So I kind of quite liked how this ended up, and we actually see some consequence for. Sometimes you have a protagonist that makes a kind of rash decision and you think it's all heroic at the time, and then we have a situation where we have a protagonist in this that kind of decides that they're going to be a one-man army type situation, but actually that may not have been the best option. And again, I don't want to go any further in than that, but some of the kind of the ideas here that are just subtle little character moments I thought were kind of quite good. And as I say, I actually kind of quite enjoyed some of our kind of criminal characters, and even after a while our protagonist, who I didn't think was the strongest initially at least. Let's talk about the sharks. So we have a school of great white, and you know, the Asylum, they're not exactly a high production film company. But there are some shots here, particularly when the sharks are underwater, where I do think the CGI actually looks pretty impressive. You know, when they're in submerged and we see shots underwater with these sharks, again, viewing it through the lens that we know that this is a lower budget movie, so we have to appreciate some of the restrictions that it might have, but they look okay. And in actual fact, there's some sequences here that even look pretty good. So I kind of quite liked the shark VFX overall. It's not a particularly gory movie, but there are some sort of some fun sort of attack sequences nonetheless. And it's not all kind of we do see some actually happen on screen. One of the kind of the tricks of the trade is not necessarily to show you it, but we do see some shots actually with actual shark attacks, you know, eating people and stuff like that. Although it's not ever a especially kind of gory movie. So, you know, it runs a kind of a fair old pace, I would say. It's a, you know, it's a kind of a decent movie in regards to keeping your interest. I mean, when you watch as many films as I do, sometimes my interest wanes because I've seen so many films and they struggle to hold my interest, but this one did. I was kind of enjoying the characters and enjoying the action and stuff like that. You know, so for the most part, I would say there's some positive stuff to say about this movie, and I wouldn't necessarily write it off as a shark movie made by the Asylum, which is going to be, you know, a load of old rubbish, because it's actually quite enjoyable. What doesn't work? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's not a perfect movie by any stretch, and in actual fact, this movie does have some issues. I have mentioned the VFX from the shark, and I do think they're fairly strong when we see the sharks underwater. And I will say, actually, one more positive. There's some fairly decent underwater photography here. It looks like they have actually shot out in the sea, because we do see variety of kind of fish running around. And as I mentioned, the CGI sharks look okay underwater. But when they breach and we see the sharks kind of, you know, lurch out the water and attack crates and things, or whatever, you know, vessels happen to be around, that's when the CGI looks a little cheap. And at times it looks a little cartoony. And in those sequences as well, that's when the sharks end up acting like cartoons. We see sharks. There's a sequence where there's a helicopter, and it's like it latches on like a dog, and it doesn't let go. And it's like this helicopter is dragging this shark, hanging on out the water, and things like this. So, you know, it's a little bit silly in places. I would say it plays like 90% straight, with a few kind of silly elements here and there. There are some kind of like, you know, physics that you'll be questioning. For example, these crates are kind of dropped in the sea, and you know, they sink, but at one point they're brought up and they're kind of floating like they're made of, like, they've got balloons inside. I mean, they just seem to have no weight whatsoever. So again, some of the kind of like the smaller elements here in regards to attention to detail, you know, they're a little bit lacking. Our central protagonist, this woman that's out on the water, she ends up being a little more interesting as the movie goes on. But I have to say, she is the most vanilla and boring protagonist you'll kind of meet, at least initially, and probably up until the kind of past the halfway mark. You know, I got to be honest with you, I don't think the acting was particularly solid, particularly from this actual actress. Like I said, after the halfway mark, there's a reveal, and I do think she gets a little bit more interesting. But I got to say, I almost would have preferred her not be in it to a degree, and just have a movie focused on this group of criminals, because they were more interesting characters and they had internal conflict within them. So I don't necessarily felt it needed to have this this other party in it. I understand why, because you need a good character, you need a proper altruistic character to root for, and I do understand that. But no, she's like this kind of weepy-eyed girl who's just crying all the time about her dead husband and stuff, and it's like, oh, you know, we've seen all that kind of dramatic backstory and stuff before. It's not particularly kind of interesting. I think they could have made a more interesting kind of central kind of protagonist here. So overall, you know, it's a fairly fun movie. It has a lower budget look, as it clearly is a lower budget movie, and I don't think will necessarily change anyone's mind if they only watch the kind of like the Deep Blue Seas and the Jaws and stuff like that. But if you are a fan of the kind of the mid-range, the lower budget shark movies, this is actually a fairly fun one, and I will actually give this an above average score of 6 out of 10. So it's a fun one. I quite enjoyed it, I've got to say. And, you know, if Ferrati had more budget to play with, I'd be curious to see what he would come up with. So, have you seen this movie? What did you all think of it? And leave me a comment and I shall look forward to you next time.